This was uploaded 8 days ago. It came up with my YouTube recommendeds. I didn't watch it, but I was like, that looks good enough to watch on stream, just based on the title. So let's take a look.
This video is sponsored by World of Warships. More about them in a little bit. Pregnancy, war,
Dude, what? Pregnancy, war, sponsorship. Okay, what a start to a video.
MMORPGs. What do these all have in common? They all require multiple people. But if MMORPG multiplayer, why play MMORPG alone? This is a question philosophers dating back to ancient Greece have thought about for centuries.
Dude, we went to Greece. I walked here like a year and a half ago, man. This was awesome. Yeah, we walked right up here and then we did a little tour and we took some pictures over here and posted them on Instagram, and we walked over here and then we walked back down into the city. It's Athens.
And even years. And today, the topic of playing MMOs solo is still a big point of discussion. I mean, just look at all the videos about it already made. Luckily for you, I'm also going to make a video about it. In the recent past, we've seen tons of solo-oriented game modes added to MMORPGs, usually called solo self-found modes, where you can't group with people, you can't trade with people, you have to earn everything yourself. RuneScape calls it Iron Man mode because that's cooler. And while these solo challenge modes are a relatively new thing, solo play in an MMO kind of isn't. In the days of early MMORPGs before World of Warcraft, MMOs were largely unsoloable. EverQuest was a notoriously difficult and punishing game that really required grouping to make any sort of meaningful progress. The same goes for games like Anarchy Online with its sandbox-style punishing open-world PvP system.
I mean, so we talk about this all the time, right? Like in more classic style MMOs, they forced you to group with other players because the content was hard enough that you couldn't do it alone. So it forced you to interact and say like, hey, Jimmy, can you help me with this quest? In return, I'll help you with your next quest. And you form these bonds and friendships that might or might not last a lifetime, usually not. But sometimes they do. I keep in touch with players that I met back in like TBC or Wrath. Like, it's actually kind of crazy. But, you know, whatever. So it forces interaction. Now, modern MMOs have a different design philosophy. They want to respect your time. Players are 30 or 40 years old. They have jobs, wives, kids, whatever. And they want to be able to log in. If no one's available, they want to be able to solo the content. So next expansion, Blizzard's introducing Delves, which is like solo dungeon style content. You can pretty much do everything with an LFG, looking for a group. Level yourself, do a lot of the content solo, right? So just different design philosophies for different eras. I miss the old days, to be quite frank, right? Where the content was hard enough where it's like, okay, you had to interact with other players to meaningfully interact with the world, right?
If you tried to tackle that game alone, you'd probably just die instantly. But with the release of World of Warcraft in 2004, everything changed. You could make significant progress on your character completely on your own. Almost every quest and early profession could be taken on without the help of anyone else, something the genre had never seen before. I mean, RuneScape existed since 2001 and was also a game that you could solo in a lot of ways, but people always seem to forget it, so I'm just gonna forget it too, I guess. World of Warcraft, whether the devs knew it or not, legitimized a valid way to experience MMORPGs that made the genre more accessible than it had ever been. So let me explain why lately it's been a very bad thing for these games. I want to make one thing clear though. I love playing solo. I would say it's the primary way I experience MMORPGs. Solo players and solo content have a place in MMORPGs. My issue is with the way devs are handling this content.
For me, I've played a lot of hardcore solo self-found in the last year and a half, and I love it. Here's the thing. It might sound weird. I love playing solo as well on an MMO, but I want other players to also be playing solo right next to me, so I don't feel like I'm alone. I want to see other players right next to me doing the same thing. I don't want to be alone playing solo. I want to be around other players playing solo. Is that weird? Does that make sense? So if I'm playing hardcore all by myself, there's no one typing in guild chat. There's no other players dying on deathlog. There's no one out in the world doing the same quests I'm doing. It basically feels like I'm wasting my time, Feels like there's no one that I can flex in front of or die in front of or watch them die in front of me and have the shared experience. Even though I'm playing alone, even though I'm not in a group, even though I'm not doing dungeons, even though I'm not doing raids. It's like I want to play on a server with a lot of other players, even if I'm playing solo, right? Just that's a distinction.
Either trying to outright stop people from playing solo or to cater to solo players a little too heavy-handedly. Both of these sides lose sight of what makes solo play in an MMORPG great. I also think that solo MMOs are... Sorry guys, this is the manifestation of my internalized anxiety. What are you doing here? Married? Oh, that's great. What's World of Warships?
Wow, good sponsor plug. All right.
Sorry, not to cut you off, but I think it might be easier if you just possess my body and then speak through me. World of Warships is a free-to-play naval warfare simulation game available now on PC and consoles, and they're also the sponsor of today's video.
Not a bad
You can
plug.
download World of Warships right now at the link in the description, and if you use promo code BRAVO at registration, you'll get a huge starter pack full of things like 500 doubloons, 1.5 million credits, 7 days of premium account access, and a free ship once you complete 10 battles. Oh man, dude, that actually sounds really cool. How about I talk about the rest of World of Warships and you don't possess my body? It actually really scares me when you do that. Honestly, dude, the coolest thing I'm seeing about World of Warships is the new content released every single month. I mean, that's wild. There's things like new ships, new cosmetics, and more, and it's all tied together with these state-of-the-art graphics with dynamic weather, water textures that make the game look like the real deal. Oh, come on, man, don't possess me. Time to join the Discord and see what's going on in there. Dude, when I ask you not to possess me, please don't possess me. Download World of Warships now at the link in the description, and don't forget to use code BRAVO to get all those free goodies I talked about earlier.
We did it.
Part 1. Why we play alone. It's important that we figure out why people even choose to play solo in the first place. It's a topic that to this day confuses Redditors and forum posters, and those are some of the smartest people in the world. Like I said before, this is a well-treaded topic on YouTube, but I keep coming back to this talk at GEC by prolific MMO game designer Damien Schubert. Damien's worked on games ranging from Meridian 59, the first ever 3D MMORPG. He's also worked on The Sims Online, which is one of the MMOs ever made. And at the time of the talk in 2011, he was the lead designer on Star Wars: The Old Republic. Ever heard of it? You haven't? Oh, it's an MMO. Now Damien spends his time on Twitter complaining about protesters and giving his opinion on rap beef by saying, "You think Drake versus Kendrick is crazy? You should try listening to Fleetwood Mac." In this talk called The Loner, Damien talks about why and what types of people play alone in a genre that's greatest selling point is the multiplayer aspect. One really great point he touches on early is that the ability to be a loner is a uniquely MMO experience. The whole concept of a loner is predicated on the existence of other players. That in and of itself is a reason someone might want to play solo. It's like making an out-of-the-box build in an RPG and challenging yourself to complete the game. It's not a wrong way to play, it's a unique way to play. And it's a cool feeling even if you prefer playing alone to see other real people running around playing the same game as you. You can play solo and still feel like you're a part of the community. This type of player is one Damien describes as the soloer, a player who is either challenging themselves or just enjoys the MMORPG for what it is. They enjoy grinding and questing and leveling and
But when you get like a cool mount or a cool, you know, quest complete or a cool level or cool gear, you can still show it off to other players because the time you spent isn't wasted because there's people populated in the game. Like, for me, a lot of people, like, I'm familiar with this dialogue because a lot of people ask me, well, why don't you play more hardcore? It doesn't matter if other people are playing because it's solo anyway. And it's like, yeah, but it's more fun when there's like hundreds or thousands of people online, like constantly dying on your death log, and everyone types F when you die, and then you go again and you rejoin the guild and everyone's like, welcome back, you know, like, yeah.
For them, participating in that experience with other players isn't that important. This is just one of 10 types of loners Damien talks about in his talk, but if I went through all of them, I'd have to put Subway Surfers on the screen to keep your attention, and I'm not willing to do that. Plus, some of the types of players he talks about are just like, I don't want to call them wrong, but they're just like, interesting. No, I'm not putting Subway Surfers back on the screen. The first player Damien touches on is the new player. New players, I think, are the best example of a forgotten type of solo players. These aren't people who are necessarily choosing to play solo, or they might not even be people who want to play solo. But when you start a new game, especially an MMO, there's a lot going on and a lot to take in. If a game has the ability to be soloed early on so that new players can take their time, learn the abilities, feel out how the game mechanics work, and all around get their feet under them, they'll be a lot more prepared and willing to do group content in the future. This comfort is also a lot more likely to retain players, because while boring a new player is seen as the cardinal sin of game design, overwhelming them is just as bad, and other players are extremely overwhelming. The comments on the talk, which I think are super valuable in and of themselves, say as much. Other players, when you're trying to take your time and learn about the game or the lore, often just get in the way. Wait, did I just call a comment section valuable? That can't be right. Let me find one that's absolutely worthless. This guy swallowing heavily in the microphone is the thing I'll remember most of this conference. That's pretty worthless, but I mean, he has a point.
W. Dude, new players, when they get into group content for the first time, especially in an older game, right? So Soda Poppin's been playing League of Legends recently, and he's made some comments on how hard it is to get into it when, like, you don't know all the spells in the game. You don't even know all the characters and the players in the game, and you kind of are champions. Is that what they're called? Champions in the game. And it's like people are just flaming you for not knowing. It's like, bro, I'm a new player. I don't know what any of this stuff does. Same thing in WoW. If you don't have weak auras, add-ons installed, know every fight, every mechanic, and you accidentally stand in the fire one time and die, and it's like, dude, what the heck is wrong with you? You're a noob. Or Counter-Strike, you don't know all the strats because the game's been out for 20 years and people just expect you to know. Yeah, it can be pretty tough, you know? It can be real tough.
Damien, drink some water! The last type of person Damien identifies that I want to talk about is what he calls the lunch at your desk type. He just means grown-ups. Hey, Future Idol here. I'm being really mean to Damien right now. It's a good talk. I don't know why I was so rude to him. Over the years, the average MMO player has gotten older, which, despite sounding like a stupidly obvious statement, is also true. Like, back in the day, there were a bunch of teenagers and people in their early 20s and literal children running around these games. But today, you're not gonna find very many children at all on MMORPGs.
That's weird to think about.
That's why the Minecraft YouTubers won't log on. The average MMO player today is much more likely to be a 30-year-old with a full-time job and potentially even...
The average age of a WoW player is 31.9 years old. Most of whom have been with the game since the 2000s. It is also have more players age 50 plus than it does in the 18 to 24 bracket. Oh my gosh. Guys, we are a bunch of boomers playing a boomer game. Holy crap. There are more 50-year-olds than 18 to 24-year-olds on WoW? What? Oh my gosh.
A kid or two. And when you have that much real-world responsibility filling up your schedule, it can be hard to find an uninterrupted 2 or 3 hours to do a raid or a group questing session. I mean, hell, it could even be hard to find a 45-minute period to do a dungeon run. And even if these types of players do find like 3 hours to play the game uninterrupted, their social battery might be so drained that they really value the time to just play on their own. Grown-ups are busy people, and they're also just all around worse, like the All Grown Up TV show. It was worse than Rugrats. That's like the whole point. That's the video I said. There are obviously a ton of other reasons someone might prefer to or even need to play solo in an MMO, and Damien's talk does a good job of touching on a lot of those, so I'd highly recommend watching it. I just felt the need to add this section to defend people like me who get told we're a paradox for playing an MMO mostly or entirely alone. But if I'm saying all of this to support solo style play, what's with the title of the video? Well, That's because of the thing that's about to pop up on the screen. Part 2. Fixing I can't do an accent. As I've said multiple times in this video, the persistent multiplayer worlds of MMORPGs are their most unique and greatest selling point. There's a very good reason for MMOs to try their best to steer into group content. The content that takes up the most design, development, and QA time in any MMO is multiplayer content. I'm sorry, I couldn't keep a straight face saying QA. I know these guys aren't testing their games. Raids, dungeons, elite quests, or heroic quests, or whatever you want to call your special quests, fates, etc. Tons of examples of content that require or strongly encourage having a group. And a lot of this content is seen as the highlight of the game by the community that plays it. Multiplayer content also has the added benefit of being one of the best ways to convert casual players into hardcore players. This is something else that Damien brings up in his GDC talk. Every player starts off as a casual player, but over time and at their own pace, if everything goes well, they'll drift closer and closer to being a hardcore player. And the goal for every MMO is to get casual players to being hardcore players. Multiplayer content being the best way to create hardcore players isn't really surprising. When you look at a ton of endgame content, which tends to be the multiplayer content, it all lives down here on the spectrum. And if you do enough multiplayer content, you'll start to form social bonds with other players, and there's no better way to get people connected to a game than for them to have actual relationships formed through that game. I'm sure we all have friends that—
Guys, we were forming social bonds yesterday playing RPGs. When we were getting our butts kicked yesterday, taking massive L's back to back, we are forming social bonds together that will last a lifetime, all right? It's phenomenal.
That we met on our favorite MMORPGs from our childhood that we either still talk to or at the very least still think about every so often. I'd like to quickly apologize also. If you're an active MMO player, I did not mean to put you on a second spectrum. Anyway, game designers really want to make sure they can get as many people to this multiplayer content as possible. And that means they have to fix solo players. I mean, these players aren't doing dungeons. They're not raiding. They haven't joined a guild. They didn't even join the server's Discord channels to say a slur. Are they even playing an MMO? To fix these players, MMOs will sometimes create roadblocks in main storylines or character progression that cannot be advanced unless you participate in a group activity. Diablo Immortal does this by having literal dungeons that you need to be in a group in, and they are required for the main story. And don't tell me Diablo Immortal's not an MMORPG, because Blizzard can't seem to figure out that Diablo was never meant to be one, even though they keep treating it like one. Like, why was Diablo 3 always online? Why is Diablo 4 just a lightweight MMO? They're not MMOs, stop it! Sorry, this isn't supposed to be a video essay about Diablo, unless you'd want me to do that. Even real MMOs, like Final Fantasy XIV with its story dungeons, force some degree of multiplayer on you. The problem with this design paradigm isn't even that it gets in the way of solo players' experience, forcing them to do something they don't want to do. It's that it doesn't even accomplish the goal these devs are hoping it does. Social bonds are a fast track to creating hardcore players, but throwing players together in a dungeon that uses a group finder tool anyway so they can clear it super fast without ever saying a word to each other is not social. This article from Andy McAdams back in 2020 says as much, but in more detail and better written, despite the fact
that's actually true.
This article from Andy.
No forced grouping in MMOs isn't social. That's super interesting. We've talked about this a lot with like the modernity in MMOs. You have LFG, you have looking for raid, you have looking for group for PvP, and what ends up happening is you find a player to play with, you play one game, right? One arena match, one Mythic Plus run, one raid, whatever it is. And if it isn't flawless, usually what ends up happening is someone ends up rage quitting and saying like, screw you, you suck, I'm gonna go to the next one. And then they reopen Group Finder and they look for someone else and repeat the cycle over and over and over and over again. And it's kind of because it's like people become really replaceable. And the analogy I generally use is Tinder in current like dating culture, right? Like back in the day, you lived on a small farm. you had like 2 options for like who you're gonna marry. You pick one of them, you figure it out, you get married, you deal with it, and that was kind of how it worked. And people, you know, didn't get divorced and just dealt with it for the most part, right? Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, I'll let you decide. But now you have Tinder, you have these online dating apps, right? People can just swipe, keep swiping. You go on one date, it's not perfect, keep swiping, keep swiping, keep swiping, and it just becomes really toxic really, really, really fast. And we see the same thing in LFG, right? I can replace you with one click of a button. So if you're not perfect, you're gone. A little bit of road bump, you're gone, right? Back in WoW in 2010, no LFG, you had, and no Cross Realm, no BattleNet, stuff like that, like 2008, 2009, 2010, whatever. It was hard. It was hard to find a group. So if you took a loss, it wasn't like, I'm just going to rage quit. It was, let's figure out how we can get through this together, right? And that's why it's analogous to dating. It's like, let's figure out how we can actually proceed, how we can move forward together, right? And not just instantly give up on this thing, all right? And that's how these bonds are formed, and they become stronger over time. It's much different in a scenario with more of a modern approach, where it's like, let me replace you if you're not perfect, right? It's a very, very, very different mindset.
Andy McAdams back in 2020 says as much, but in more detail and better written, despite the fact that he uses the dictionary defines social as line, which is not great, Andy, let's be honest. Andy does do a great job of diving into how social bonds are formed and what makes them meaningful, and comes to the conclusion that you very rarely meet a new friend because you were forced to group with them on a project. These changes all attempt to fix a type of player that isn't broken. Some players just want to play solo, others will seek out the multiplayer content if you did a good job designing it and designing meaningful but not forceful incentives to participate in it.
People always say this, and I actually agree with the person that made this video. Incentives are actually not as important as people think. So people always say in PvP, what you need to do is incentivize people to play. Like people talk about solo shuffle a lot with healers and solo shuffle. They're like, well, incentivize them with more gold or something, or incentivize them with more. It's like, that is a band-aid fix. What's the root problem? People will play the game if it's good. You can then pay people to play the game if it's bad. But a better fix isn't to pay people to play a bad game. The better fix is to make the game so good that people want to play. Crazy idea. Crazy, I know. Because people disagree with me here, but incentivization is a band-aid a lot of the times. Now, don't get me wrong. If it's a cool incentivization, that's fine. If there's a cool amount, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But it comes secondary to actual good content, actual good gameplay. It's very, very different. If you just keep slapping on band-aids of like, oh, cool new transmog, cool new mount, cool new this. It's like, yeah, let's get the gameplay good, and then people will want to play, and then you can incentivize it. Sure, that's fine.
Forcing them to change how they play the game isn't converting them into a hardcore player. It's converting them into a different game. I'm not trying to say there shouldn't be efforts made to break solo players out of their shell, but forcing them into group content is just not the way to do that. And hey, I see you other MMOs who are bragging about catering to solo players with your content updates. You think you're off the hook on this one, right? You think so?
Bruh.
Oh gosh. Part 3, fixing solo play. Because part 2 was fixing solo players, so this is the same, but it's like a theme. Solo players don't need to be fixed. There's nothing wrong with us. But you know what else doesn't need to be fixed? Solo play. Some MMOs have correctly identified that a strong solo player base is almost as, if not just as important as a strong social player base. For that reason, they've made sure to cater new updates to solo players either exclusively or in addition to the standard multiplayer crowd. This is a great thing to do if you're planning a new leveling zone or continent or quest line, having interesting multiplayer content but making sure there's plenty to do as a solo player, as well as great game design that has been done for decades in the genre at this point. The problem comes up when the line blurs between multiplayer and solo content. The best example of this, in my opinion, is Old School RuneScape. Back in 2017, Old School RuneScape got a new piece of content called Raids, and it was touted as the first ever piece of content that really required other players to get best in slot loot. I mean that with all due respect to the Cowfight Queen and to the King Black Dragon. By 2017, they were both soloable and also irrelevant. Eventually, players did find out how to solo this raid, and it's now a very popular thing to do, but it took some time and it's still decently difficult. But with the next raid, the Theater of Blood, the old school RuneScape team really set out to make the hardest raid yet, and also one that would not be soloable. And while Theater of Blood has been soloed before, it's very, very few players who have ever done it, and it requires a ton of skill and time. Theater of Blood stands as the only piece of content that you're really gonna need to group up with other players to do if you want the loot from it. But with the third raid is when we got an interesting design shift from Jagex, the creators of old school RuneScape. This third raid, called Tombs of a Masket, featured variable difficulty through the invocation system, meaning you could choose what mechanics bosses did and didn't have to make the raid as hard as you wanted to make it. Obviously, this comes with changes in how common loot drops are and what the best drops you can get are. But something else they did that I thought was really weird is that they actually put design considerations in the raid for if you entered solo. Things like making certain rooms just faster to complete if you're alone. So the variable difficulty combined with these design considerations means that solo was and is a completely viable way to do this raid, and in some cases it can even be optimal. Is it really the end of the world to have a solo option for a piece of content like this? No. Not really, but I do think it adds a lot to an MMORPG to have parts that are designed specifically and exclusively for groups. Some of you might be thinking that locking the best items behind group content is an example of forced multiplayer, like I talked about in part 2, but I don't think it is. In vanilla World of Warcraft, you can level from 1 to 60 completely on your own, comfortably, and have a great time doing it. Along the way though, with the elite quests and dungeons you'd have skipped, you'd be missing out on some of the best gear in the game for leveling. The difference there is that solo play is viable, but it's not optimal. Content that can be soloed exists throughout the game, but having group content that is extremely worth doing but not strictly speaking required is a really good thing. Like I said already, I'm a solo player, and when it came time to do my first Dead Mines in World of Warcraft Classic, I was dreading it. I hate talking to other people, and I especially hate letting those people down and having them flame me in chat. I don't know why, but it scares me. But
This guy is a noob. Okay.
really wanted the Cruel Barb from Edwin Van Cleef,
Yeah,
and I especially wanted the Tunic of Westfall from the quest line that ended in the Dead Mines. And if I really wanted that stuff, I had to just bite the bullet and put myself in a social situation. And what ended up happening is I had a ton of fun. A lot of that fun came from the fact that we had to organize our group through an actual chat system, meaning we had to actually send at least one message to each other. And once you send one message, it gets a lot easier to send a bunch more. So you start joking around with these people, or one of them turns out to be role-playing, and that's fun. I have had some bad experiences in dungeons, but also a lot of my favorite experiences are from grouping up with other people for these dungeons, or for the quests, or for even raids. It's the one time I get to experience the truly exclusive thing an MMORPG can offer me. And all that happened not because I was forced to do it, but because I was sufficiently tempted by good design to do it.
It is like the difference between like when you're in school and your teacher makes you read a book, and you like can't enjoy the book because you're forced to read the book, and then when you get older you like actually read a book because you want to, or you read that same book because you wanted to, and it's just like a whole different experience if you chose it yourself. It's kind of like Torghast. Everybody flamed Torghast because you needed to do it. Although Torghast, you know, if it was an optional thing for like transmog, people might have, God forbid, even enjoyed doing it. But since you had to do it and everyone was forced to do it, it kind of sucked, you know? Yeah, I mean, I can relate there.
Still, to this day, play World of Warcraft primarily solo. It's how I like to level. But I really love getting the chance to break that up with some group content that just feels good and feels natural. So the question becomes, how do we get more of that? Part 4. We literally already figured that out. It's like, what are you doing here, guys? Making solo play fun without making it required or hindering the multiplayer aspect of MMOs is a solved problem. RuneScape solved it. Guild Wars 2 solved it. World of Warcraft solved it. For some reason, these games, old and new, are now trying to force themselves to either be entirely soloable or entirely multiplayer. Solo and multiplayer are not at odds with each other. They're not harming each other. They can and have existed in MMOs for decades. Devs should absolutely continue to consider solo players when designing new content, but they should also remember when multiplayer content fits in best. They're designing an MMO. You'd be stupid to ignore the M. The analogy I made before about making a bad build in an RPG is exactly how solo play should be viewed. A bad build doesn't need to be balanced and made as good as all the other builds in the game. What's important is that a player who chooses a suboptimal build can enjoy the game and even get to the end of it, even if that means they'll do it slowly. As long as it's fun, it's okay. So for the love of God, stop forcing me to play in a group to advance your main storyline. I'll group if I want to, or if you've tempted me enough. Until then, I'm just gonna blast the Sonic Frontier soundtrack and kill 25 goblins like a good little gamer boy.
Okay, nice. Worth the watch.
Thank you again to World of Warships for sponsoring this video.
Okay,
Make sure to click the link in the description to try it out. And when you register your account, use code BRAVO for tons of free things like 500 doubloons, 1.5 million credits, 7 days of premium access, and a free ship after you complete 10 battles.
Okay, I'll do it.
You're a patron. Thank you so much for your support.
Nice. Good video. Really enjoyed that one. Worth the watch. Agreed with a lot of the points. It's something I've thought of. I thought the video was going to go somewhere else. The paradox of MMOs based on the title. I thought it was going to go somewhere else. But it's something I've actually thought about a lot because I've played a ton of hardcore in the last year. And it's like, well, I remember getting the question in the chat for the first time. Someone was like, well, why are you playing WoW solo? And I'm like, you'd be surprised. It actually works really well. It's a lot of fun as long as other people are also playing around me. But I don't want to play with them. I just want the feeling of other players around me. Anyway, yo, GG's. Let's actually play the game. Let's do it.